Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the gritty world of medieval bathrooms. A time when flushing toilets didn't exist, chamber pots overflowed, and personal hygiene was more myth than practice. It's gross, it's weird, and yes, it's fascinating. So before you settle in, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy this kind of strange historical deep dive. And hey, drop a comment below. Where are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now? You wake up to the faint warmth of someone else. Mistake. It's not the sun greeting you. No, it's the family chamber pot sitting proudly next to the bed, radiating yesterday's regrets like a scented candle from hell. There's no lid. No shame. Just fermented waste brewing in the corner, like it's planning its own uprising. You blink once, and the stench smacks you awake. Before stretching your legs, you glance down, making sure you don't dip a toe into your cousin's midnight disaster. Everyone in the room used it. Your mother, your father, your little sister, who insists she missed. Even your grandmother, who swears she hasn't gone in days, but somehow still contributes every night. Visitors, of course. They'd whisper, "Thank you," as they hovered over the pot like it was a sacred relic. No one questioned it. No one escaped it. It was a communal masterpiece, a bubbling broth of bodily betrayal. There was no designated cleaner. Whoever woke up last got the job. And if you tried to fake sleep, your mother had ways of knowing. Eyes in the back of her head, and a nose trained to detect lies and urine. She'd thrust the pot into your arms before you could object, muttering something about building character, as if marinating your fingers in waste was a noble rite of passage. On particularly cold mornings, the pot steamed. Steam, as if it were proud of itself. Rising tendrils of stink kissed your face as you tiptoed toward the door, praying your foot wouldn't find the damp sock you dropped last night. Outside, the air was just as cruel. Wind lashed your skin, but at least it didn't smell like fermented carrots and fear. Dumping the pot into the nearest ditch felt like an exorcism. You'd glance around, hoping no one saw you. But of course they did. Neighbours, already doing their own shameful morning dump runs, gave a nod of solidarity. A small, unspoken community of reluctant waste handlers. One old man even saluted you once. You never figured out if it was respect or mockery. Maybe both. But in that moment, sharing your chamber pot fate, you understood him deeply. Back inside, you'd return the pot to its corner, empty now but never clean. It wasn't washed. It just sat there, awaiting its next offering, like a cursed goblet. If someone had the nerve to question its presence, the answer was always, "Where else would we go?" And honestly, no one had a better suggestion. The alternative was worse: finding a bush, risking a public view, and possibly frostbite. You learned to step lightly. Always check the shadows before you walked. More than once someone stumbled in the dark and fell face first into disaster. Screams followed. Then laughter. Then more screaming when someone else slipped on the original mess. Towels were rare. Soap was a luxury. Pride didn't exist. But at least you got to know your neighbours really, really well. And let's not forget the surprise refills. Nothing like sitting down beside the pot for breakfast and hearing that unmistakable splash from behind the curtain. No warning. No apology. Just eye contact. Maybe a shrug. Then silence. You learned to eat quickly before the next wave of pot contributions stole your appetite entirely. Breakfast and bathroom were sometimes 10 feet apart, sometimes less. Children, of course, had no filter. They announced their usage proudly. I did a big one. Your little cousin would squeal. The adults ignored him, pretending dignity still had a role in the household. But you knew. You all knew. He was the only one honest enough to say what everyone else was doing in secret. That pot heard more truths than the village priest. Even romance wasn't safe. You ever tried impressing someone while sitting next to the family pot? Didn't think so. Courting a girl in that house meant pretending you didn't notice the stench or the slow bubble of something unholy rising from the corner. If she stayed, she loved you. If she ran, well, who could blame her? The pot was the ultimate test of loyalty. And every morning the cycle repeated. Someone would groan, someone else would trip, the pot would be full, and you'd be back outside in the cold. You didn't question it. You didn't fight it. The pot had won. It ruled the room like a throne of shame. And while you may have dreamed of castles and comfort, the truth was simpler. Your day began and ended with a warm bucket of regret. But you haven't even seen what the rest of the house holds. Because in medieval times, the floor wasn't always for walking. You step into a humble medieval cottage, and the first thing that hits you isn't the warmth of a fire or the smile of a host. It's the smell. Not just the old wood and hay smell. No, this is something more organic. The floor beneath your feet is dirt, compacted over years by boots, bare feet, and time itself. But it's not just dirt. Blended into this soil is waste. Human, animal, and emotional. The cottage floor doesn't just hold memories, it holds deposits. Rural folks didn't always have chamber pots. They had corners, dark, secluded spots near the walls, behind crates, or beside the dog's bed. When nature called, and you were too tired or cold to step outside, you'd shuffle to your favourite corner, lift your tunic or dress, and squat low, praying you would be seen. No judgment, no shame. Everyone knew. Sometimes even the family goat looked away politely. And then there were the animals, chickens especially. Ever seen a chicken peck at human waste? If you haven't, consider yourself blessed. These feathered janitors scurried around, flapping their wings and pecking at anything that moved or stank. You'd think they were helpful, but really they just spread things around more evenly. A sort of medieval redistribution system. They weren't pets. They were co-workers, handling sanitation with beaks instead of mops. Dogs played their part too. But they weren't subtle. A dog might sniff a pile, lick it, and return to the hearth like nothing happened. Then your kid would hug that same dog moments later. Hygiene as a concept hadn't yet been invented, at least not outside castles and monasteries. The floor was more than the base of a home. It was a diary of digestion. You'd grow up watching your elders relieve themselves in corners, and you'd do the same. It wasn't weird. It was just life. Just like modern kids flush without thinking, medieval kids knew how to aim for the dry patches. If a visitor came by and stepped in something squishy, the appropriate response wasn't, "Oh no." It was a shrug, and maybe a sorry about that. You just hoped they didn't track it onto your sleeping straw. Now imagine winter. No sunlight. Just grey days and longer nights. The ground inside the cottage freezes, and so does the waste. Frozen excrement doesn't smell as much, sure, but it becomes a hazard. Ever slipped on your own frozen business while trying to grab a morning bite of bread? Welcome to peasant life. A place where slipping on poop was a daily gamble, not a punchline in a cartoon. Visitors were always a risk. They might arrive with gifts, cheesecloth, maybe a bottle of weak beer, and walk straight into last week's accidents. You'd warn them too late, of course. But they'd understand. They probably just stepped out of the same situation in their own homes. Hospitality wasn't about cleanliness. It was about warmth, sharing food, and hoping the rats didn't steal the bread before the guests took their slice. The floor absorbed more than just physical things. It soaked up stories. That dark stain in the back corner, that's where Grandma had an accident during the Great Storm of '83. 1283 that is, and the shallow trench by the door. Dug out during a fever outbreak so waste would flow outside, except it didn't always. Sometimes it flowed under the bed, and sometimes that bed belonged to the baby. Shoes weren't always worn indoors, but when they weren't there to keep your feet warm. They were armor, shields against soft surprises and unexpected squelches. The soles wore down fast, but not because of rough terrain, because they were constantly stepping on reminders of dinner. You'd go to sleep with the smell still in your nose, clinging to your clothes, whispering sweet nothings into your dreams. This lifestyle wasn't lazy. It was survival. With no sewage system, no plumbing, no gloves, and barely enough daylight to finish all the chores, something had to give. And that something was dignity. But dignity is a modern luxury. Back then, people measured success by how warm you stayed, how fed your kids were, and whether you made it through winter, without burying anyone. If you had to squat behind the bench while your toddler played with a stick, so be it. The funny thing is, people adapted. They learned to live with the smell. Their noses adjusted, their pride dulled, and their laughter remained. Jokes were made. Songs were sung. And yes, people still fell in love, got married, and made babies on floors, not 3 feet from yesterday's disaster. You don't get softer from living like this. You get sharper, harder. You build resilience in the worst places and call it home. And just when you think it can't get worse than using your kitchen floor as a toilet, you realize that wasn't even the most chaotic option available. Because in some places there wasn't even a floor to begin with, just a bucket, a bush, or maybe the side of a wooden bridge. But we'll get to that soon. You didn't have a bathroom, not even a chamber pot if you were unlucky, or just too poor to afford one. Instead, when nature called, you had 3 classic options: the bucket, the bush, or the bridge. Each choice came with its own version of humiliation. The bucket was a luxury, often borrowed or shared. The bush meant braving thorns and bugs with your rear exposed. And the bridge, well, it offered height, visibility, and a generous splash zone below. Privacy. That's a modern fantasy. Let's start with the bush, shall we? Picture it. A narrow path beyond the village, just wide enough for your feet, but wild enough for snakes, stinging nettles, and the occasional judgmental goose. You squat fast, holding your tunic like a curtain, and hoping the wind doesn't betray you. There's no wiping. Just a quick shuffle, maybe a leaf if you're brave, and a sprint back to safety. The smell? You stop noticing. Your nose adjusts, or your pride dies. Either works. But maybe you chose the bucket today. A wooden one, half-rotted, once used for oats or laundry. It's cold in the morning, sticky in the afternoon, and always somehow wet. You carry it to a quiet spot behind the house, pretending you don't see your neighbour doing the same with hers. Eye contact is a mistake. You squat. You sigh, and you pray the bucket doesn't tip, because tipping means the shame parade begins. And medieval shame was a public sport. Then there's the infamous footbridge, the town's unofficial restroom with a view. These bridges span streams or ditches, offering a natural flushing system powered by rain or runoff. But during dry seasons the waste just lingered. People walking underneath knew to tread carefully. And above you'd find men and women squatting side by side, pants down, gossiping, while creating whirlpools of doom below. It was gross. It was public. But it was efficient. Kind of like Twitter, but with smells instead of opinions. The irony. None of this was considered abnormal. Kids learned to squat before they learned to write. Old folks told poop tales like they were bedtime stories. And travellers? They developed a sixth sense for which walls, had the least fecal build-up. A quiet corner. Jackpot. A warm rock. Bonus. A dry breeze. A miracle. Nobody asked, "Where's the toilet?" They just asked, "Who went here last?" And you could usually tell by the color, texture, or steam. Imagine being on a first date in medieval times. You take her to the market. You buy her some cheese. Maybe you even score a piece of dried fruit. And then nature calls. But there's no "excuse me." Instead, you walk 50 paces behind a barn, take a knee, and handle your business, while making small talk about the weather. She does the same one bush over. Romantic, right? And if you were lucky, there was a communal cloth nearby. If not, it's back to the moss. Let's not forget how people marked their favorite spots. Some scratched symbols into the wall. Others left a stone or a stick nearby, a medieval, occupied sign. Of course, animals didn't care. Dogs sniffed. Pigs rooted. Chickens occasionally stole things you'd rather forget. The lines between human and animal waste blurred quickly. In fact, some people preferred following livestock trails because the animals did their business in the same place. Efficiency in its most unsettling form. Sometimes accidents happened, like slipping on a frost-covered pile in the dark, or realizing too late that you'd squatted on an anthill, or worse, making your move during a festival and becoming part of the entertainment. People laughed. They always laughed. And you laughed too. Because if you didn't, you cried. Medieval life was messy. Everyone stank. Everyone squatted. And nobody judged, unless you used the church wall. That was frowned upon, sometimes punished. The health risks. Let's not sugarcoat it. Open defecation led to everything from foot infections to intestinal parasites. Flies were constant companions. So were boils, rashes, and mysterious itches that spread through villages faster than gossip. Doctors gave great advice like avoid cold draughts or rub onions on your feet. Sanitation wasn't science yet. It was more like hopeful witchcraft mixed with creative denial. Still, you lived. Mostly. And when you didn't, well, there was always another body for the ditch. What makes this all worse is how normal it felt. When you grow up without a toilet, you don't dream of porcelain. You dream of dry grass, soft moss, or a day when it doesn't rain. You don't crave privacy. You crave balance, timing, and luck. And weirdly, these rituals bonded people. Friends pooped together. Enemies gave each other space. Families passed down tips like heirlooms. And in the quietest moments, with your knees bent and your eyes on the horizon, you thought, maybe tomorrow, you'll try the bridge. And so, the routine continues. Bush in spring, bucket in winter, bridge when desperate. You rotate your options like a peasant's version of fine dining. And through it all you learn one thing: survival isn't about comfort. It's about adaptation. You went weak. You went filthy. You were just playing the hand you were dealt, and using whatever patch of earth gave you a moment of peace, which, by the way, wouldn't last, because the next storm was coming, and the streets are about to become soup again. You lean out your window in the cool morning breeze, and nearly lose your breakfast to the stench. It isn't just the fishmongers stall down the alley or the manure wagon trundling past. No, what just hit your nostrils is a cocktail of chamber pot stew, goat pea, and last night's stew being flung from a third-floor window. See, in medieval towns, windows didn't just let the air in. They let everything out. And if you were below, you'd better be quick or be baptized. The words, "Gardez l'eau," ring out across cobbled streets like a warning shot. French for, watch out for the water, but no one's pouring tea. the medieval equivalent of a toilet flush, and it comes from above, sometimes with zero warning. You had to listen as you walked, keeping one ear tuned for that dreaded cry, and your feet light, ready to leap. Because what followed wasn't a sprinkle. It was a splash, and not the refreshing kind. And don't think this was a rare occurrence. In cramped city streets where dozens of households lined a single alley, chamber pots were emptied multiple times per day. There were no plumbing systems, no backyards, no sanitation workers, just gravity and hope. If you were unlucky, your laundry day ended with a brown streak across your tunic. If you were really unlucky, you opened your mouth at the wrong moment. History doesn't record those screams, but trust me, they happened. Even the design of medieval homes made things worse, with streets barely wide enough for a cart to pass. Upper floors jutted out above the lower ones. That meant your window was practically hanging over the street. Convenient for dumping waste. Not so convenient for the people below. Architects of the time weren't thinking about waste disposal systems. They were too busy trying to build something that wouldn't collapse during the next thunderstorm. Speaking of storms, rain didn't clean the streets. It turned them into slushies of sewage. The cobblestones collected more than just mud. Think rotting food scraps, animal entrails, spilled ale, and of course human waste. A good downpour just stirred the pot. The mixture sloshed into your shoes, crept up your trousers, and clung to your skin like a vengeful ghost. Street soup, some folks called it, though hopefully not while eating. Some towns tried to fix the problem. In London, for example, bylaws eventually required folks to build privy pits and gutters. But enforcement was spotty, and people were lazy. Why dig a hole when you've got a perfectly good window and a strong arm? You weren't evil for doing it, just practical. And besides, everyone else did it too. It wasn't barbaric. It was normalized. Like bad Wi-Fi today, or reusing your coffee cup one too many times. To make matters more horrifying, consider what happened to the waste once it hit the street. With no sewer system in place, it pooled in open ditches or flowed into shallow canals, assuming your town had them. These rivers of filth attracted flies, rats, and worse. Kids played near them. Dogs lapped them up, and sometimes during dry seasons, the waste dried and turned to dust, only to be kicked up into the air and breathed in. That medieval cough? Probably not just a cold. Tourists today walk medieval towns in awe, snapping photos of quaint stone buildings and flower-boxed windows. What they don't see, and certainly don't smell, is the reality of what once cascaded from those windows daily. It's easy to romanticize history when you're not dodging airborne feces or scrubbing your tunic with vinegar. But if you could go back in time, your first instinct might be to find an umbrella, and your second, gas mask. And imagine being the poor soul who lived on the ground floor. You paid less rent, sure, but you also got less dignity. Waste from 3 stories up painted your shutters, seeped into your cracks, and sometimes even entered your home if your windows were open. Some tenants hung cloth canopies over their windows to deflect the barrage, a medieval version of an awning, but for poop. And even then, some of it always found a way in. Windows weren't innocent architectural features. They were tools. Tools of relief for some and torture for others. The rich lived higher up, safer from the splash zone. The poor? They walked the gauntlet every day, heads ducked and eyes scanning the sky. He created a class system based on elevation. The higher your window, the fewer your stains. In medieval cities, heaven really was up above, and hell dripped from its eaves. If you're wondering why people didn't revolt or change the system, they did try. Cities passed ordinances. Fines were issued. Citizens were scolded. But when your chamber pot's full, and the alley's right there, old habits die harder. Besides, dumping it outside kept the stench out of your house. And if you think about it, it's not too different from today. We just push a lever and it all disappears. Out of sight, out of smell. And yet, even with all that mess, life carried on. People courted, laughed, danced through streets that squished underfoot. They told stories under dripping awnings and clinked mugs in taverns that smelled of wet stone. And worse. It was all part of the backdrop, the texture of their world. A foul one, sure, but familiar. And just as you settle into that idea, ready to accept the open window poop parade as a way of life, let's take a seat side by side for the next stop. You shuffle into the communal latrine, your eyes still adjusting to the dim light, seeping through the one tiny window, if you're lucky enough to have one. Wooden benches stretch wall to wall, each with a row of evenly spaced holes, like the world's most degrading piano. There's no privacy, no partition, not even a vague sense of shame. Just you, your neighbours, and the sounds of synchronized suffering. And guess what? You're expected to talk through the entire process, like it's small talk over tea. You sit down, the plank creaking under your weight, and immediately regret everything. The wood is damp, cold, and faintly sticky from 1,000 other behinds. There's no toilet paper, of course. Just a faint hope that your tunic doesn't touch the splattered floor. Guy beside you leans over, chewing a piece of hard bread, and casually asks how your crops are doing. You're trying to push. He's trying to gossip. It's an intimate disaster in progress. These public latrines were the social hubs of medieval life, as strange as that sounds. People didn't just relieve themselves here. They exchanged news, made business deals, even gossiped about who hadn't shown up in a few days. The medieval version of a group chat didn't need Wi-Fi. It just needed a long wooden bench, a few groaning bellies, and the smell of old cabbage wafting from beneath your seat. If you weren't there, people would assume you were either dead or had something to hide. The worst part, the smell was legendary. These weren't places that got cleaned regularly. Waste pooled beneath the boards, or in a shallow trench, slowly fermenting into a stew of shame and ammonia. Add in a warm summer day, and you've basically recreated the seventh circle of hell. You didn't sit down, you descended into it, nose first. And the stench clung to your clothes, your hair, and your pride. Soap wasn't common, but trauma. Oh, that was free. Now imagine bringing your kids along. Because you would. Children didn't get their own special potty or privacy. They joined the communal chaos. You'd help them squat, try not to drop them in, and then field curious questions while a stranger, 2 holes down, gave unsolicited parenting advice, all while trying to focus on your own urgent business. It was a bonding experience, in the most horrifying sense of the word. Sometimes rats would scamper between the floorboards, feasting on the waste. They weren't scared of humans anymore. They'd sit by your foot, licking their tiny rat lips, watching like grim little spectators at the theatre of bodily functions. And the worst part, no one flinched. Everyone was used to it. That's how broken the standards had become. A rat near your butt wasn't a crisis. It was a Tuesday. And then there was the awkward moment when someone made eye contact. Accidental glances were common, especially when benches faced each other, which was more often than not. Locking eyes mid-squat with your neighbour's uncle, while both of you strain like medieval kettles. That's a moment that burns itself into the soul. And there's no polite way to break that kind of eye contact. Just nod and keep going. The design of these latrines was efficient if your goal was to create maximum discomfort. Some had minimal ventilation, a window, maybe a gap in the ceiling. But many were enclosed, trapping in heat, odour and bacteria. It became a petri dish of humanity, baking slowly beneath the wooden beams. Breathing through your mouth didn't help. You tasted it. You became it. You left a piece of yourself behind, figuratively and literally. Yet despite the horror, people kept coming. Not just because they had to, but because these spaces were woven into the fabric of daily life. You couldn't avoid them. They were central to your schedule, your community, and your immune system's toughest training ground. Getting sick from a public latrine was practically a rite of passage. If you didn't fall ill at least once, you weren't truly living. And oh, the sounds! Medieval acoustics were unforgiving. Every grunt, splash, groan, and victory sigh echoed off the stone or timber walls. Conversations had to compete with symphonies of distress. You'd hear debates about tax policies and which chicken laid the best eggs, all punctuated by explosive punctuation from someone's digestive tract. It was a place of noise, nonsense, and necessary evil. But perhaps the strangest part was the normalization of it all. This wasn't a scene from some dystopian joke. It was everyday reality. And no one questioned it. If you didn't join in, you'd be mocked or mistrusted. Why don't they use the latrine? Was the medieval equivalent of, why don't they have an Instagram? People expected you to show up, share a bowel movement, and a bit of gossip. Community meant everything, even here. And as you finally stood, muscles sore and dignity drained, you realized you'd survived another visit. You wiped yourself with whatever was on hand, rag, moss, or sheer denial, and shuffled out, hoping the wind would cleanse the lingering scent. But before you could truly escape the memory, someone shouted behind you, "Same time tomorrow?" And just like that, you knew you'd be back. You'd think living in a castle meant luxury, right? Grand halls, roaring fires, feather beds. But step inside a medieval guardrobe and all illusions crumble. The royal toilet wasn't gold-plated or velvet-lined. It was a narrow stone box jutting out from the castle wall, with a single hole carved into the seat, and a straight drop to whatever moat or pit lay below. The smell didn't rise gently. It surged up like a curse. And every time you sat down, you were essentially hanging your rear out to dry. Now imagine winter. Wind slicing through stone corridors, your robe flapping like a distressed flag, and your bare flesh perched above open air. There was no insulation, no fire, no mercy. That hole in the wall became a portal to frostbite. Your cheeks froze to the seat. A sudden gust could send you into a full-body shiver mid-bowel movement. Royal dignity be damned. Everyone trembled on that throne. Even the kings behind was not spared from the bite of December winds. Then there was the noise. Waste plummeting several stories down made a sound that echoed through the stone like cannon fire. Anyone standing outside knew exactly what business was being conducted above. And if you were particularly unlucky, your contributions might not land cleanly. They could splatter onto the castle wall or slide down into view like a grotesque waterfall. Walking beneath the guardrobes was a game of medieval Russian roulette. One wrong step, and you'd become part of history's grossest baptism. Security? Practically non-existent. These architectural outhouses were literal holes in the castle's defences. During sieges, clever invaders would crawl up the waste chutes, braving filth and disease to sneak into the inner chambers. Can you imagine scaling a vertical shaft of human sludge just to get stabbed by a surprised knight at the end? Oh, that's not just war. That's psychological warfare. The smell alone could cause desertion. Yet some poor soul still tried and sometimes succeeded, breaching the stronghold via the back door, quite literally. The rats didn't mind the draft. They thrived in the moist underbelly of these vertical waste tubes. Scurrying up at night, they sometimes surprised nobles with a twitching tail against the ankle mid-squat. No candlelight, no warning. Just the squeak in the shadows and the realization that you were not alone. Many a scream echoed from those walls, not from ghosts or assassins, but from a terrified duke with his pants down, locked in mortal combat with a sewer rat the size of a boot. These toilets weren't even exclusive to castles. Wealthy merchants and clergy sometimes had similar contraptions built onto their homes. The problem? Not everyone had a moat. So instead of waste falling into water, it simply dropped into barrels, into alleys, onto unlucky pedestrians. And in cities where buildings were crammed together, your bathroom break might splash onto your neighbour's wall, which is probably why medieval architecture evolved tall, narrow, and grudge-filled. You didn't just build a home, you built a fortress against feces. And cleanliness? Pure fantasy. There was no flushing, no regular scrubbing, no lavender-scented anything. The stone holes were often crusted with residue from decades of royal digestion. Sometimes moss grew around the opening, as if nature itself tried to plug the horror. You might light a candle to fight the stench, but it only turned the space into a warm sulphuric gas chamber. You left quickly. No one lingered in the guardrobe. Even gossip died the moment someone entered. It was a sacred space, of silent suffering, but it wasn't all terror. Some castles tried to improve things. A few added wooden seats, like proto-toilet bowls, carved with care and occasionally cushioned with fabric. Imagine that medieval luxury was a padded plank over a pit of despair. Others built chutes that angled away from the walls, hoping to launch the waste further from the castle base. This usually failed spectacularly, turning nearby fields into no man's lands of steaming reminders. The engineering ambition was there, the execution not so much. Yet still, the guardrobe remained a point of pride. Having an indoor toilet meant status. The higher it was built, the more important the user. Kings pooped from heights of 5 stories. Dukes, maybe 3. Peasants, ground level, if they were lucky. So yes, medieval hierarchy extended even to your bathroom altitude. Literally looking down on others while doing your business wasn't symbolic. It was architectural. And like most things in feudalism, your view of the world depended entirely on where you sat. You might think the ladies had it better. Nope. Women endured the same drafty, rat-infested chambers, often in cumbersome dresses with layers of petticoats and corsets. Ever try balancing over a stone hole while hoisting 20 pounds of wool and linen? One wrong slip, and you'd be baptizing your hem in the royal soup. Many women used chamber pots instead, emptying them discreetly, or not so discreetly, out of windows. Either way, elegance was a myth. Everyone was just trying not to fall in. And let's not forget the servants. Wastichan. They were responsible for scraping and hauling whatever accumulated beneath the chutes. Sometimes they'd build cesspits to catch the waste, which they'd empty periodically with buckets and shovels. No gloves, no masks. Just medieval resolve and deadened senses. These workers didn't get fame or reward. They got infections, insults, and short lifespans. But without them, the entire castle would drown in its own filth. Ironically, the most vital job in the keep was the one no one ever talked about. So next time you see a grand castle in a fairy tale with its towering walls and sweeping views, remember the drafty little box stuck to the back. The one that rattled in the wind, whistled through its cracks, and leaped a royal stream down the side of history. That, dear dreamer, is where empires sat, cold, exposed, and praying no enemy crawled up for a surprise visit. And speaking of enemies from below, our next stop smells even worse. Toilet paper? You're hilarious. You ever miss a spot and feel like your whole day's cursed? Now imagine having nothing but straw. Yes, literal straw, to do the job. That's what most medieval folks had. Not even soft hay, but coarse, scratchy stuff that felt like scraping barn flooring against your skin. No wonder they walked funny. But hey, at least straw was considered an upgrade, if you were lucky enough to find some dry. Most days you just made do with what nature offered. Leaves, bark, maybe moss if the forest was feeling generous. Now, don't get it twisted. Moss sounds fancy until it's damp and full of bugs. And if you think that's bad, some people wiped with their bare hands. No shame. just a quick swipe. Maybe a rinse in the nearest stream, and back to dinner. This wasn't an act of desperation. It was routine. You'd shake someone's hand and silently hope they were right-handed, because the left was universally known as the dirty hand. Social codes built around sanitation, or the lack of it. And then there were the fancy folks, nobles, who had access to cloth. Not luxurious toilet paper, but shared rags. Reusable ones. One family rag passed around, like a cursed heirloom. To hang on a peg near the chamber pot, and if you were lucky, it wasn't already heavily seasoned. The smell, unforgettable. And you'd better believe they didn't wash it daily. That rag saw things, unspeakable things, and it still had to report for duty every morning. Soap? Ha! That was a luxury reserved for royalty, or religious occasions. For everyone else, water had to suffice, if it was even clean to begin with. Bathing was infrequent, and wiping was about as effective as brushing your teeth with a stick of butter. It didn't help that the whole hygiene system was less about cleanliness and more about getting by without bleeding. Remember, rashes and infections were common, especially when you're wiping with bark or shared cloth. It's a miracle people didn't fall apart like wet bread. The Romans had a system, sponges on sticks, kept in communal basins filled with vinegar or salt water. Sounds civilized, until you realize the same sponge was used by dozens of people. Public toilets lined with shared seats, shared sponges, and shared regrets. That method somehow trickled down centuries later, showing up in medieval monasteries and public latrines. Think of it as the earliest version of a cursed communal loofah, only more personal and far more horrifying. Even in monasteries, where discipline and ritual mattered most, cleanliness was still medieval at best. Monks had wiping cloths attached to their belts, literally tethered to them like a grim badge of honor. These weren't individual tools either. Shared. Washed infrequently. Every squat was a group effort in microbial warfare. And if someone dropped their cloth, well, let's just say there were no backup options. You either grabbed it or went medieval freestyle. And let's not forget the environmental hazards. Using leaves might sound eco-friendly today, but back then, you didn't know what kind of leaf you were picking. Stinging nettles, poison ivy, or rough foliage could turn a simple toilet break into a week of agony. That moment of desperation in the woods could lead to blisters, boils, or worse. Imagine explaining that to the town healer. No, Brother Thomas, I did not sin. I just mistook the wrong leaf. Cue the holy water. The social consequences of wiping wrong were real. If you smelled too bad, you were shunned. If you smelled too good, you were suspected of witchcraft or vanity. People didn't trust someone who didn't reek like the rest of them. So you had to strike this bizarre olfactory balance. Funky, but not too funky. Wiped too well, and suddenly you're different. And in medieval towns, different could mean dangerous. It's funny how a clean bottom could get you accused of sorcery. And yes, hemorrhoids were common. Painful. Constant dot. And untreated. All that rough material left its mark, literally. Add a wooden toilet seat splintering under your thighs, and you've got a medieval horror story worthy of its own saint. Some folks just chose not to wipe at all, deciding the itching was more tolerable than the alternatives. Can you imagine sitting on a church bench, squirming in agony, trying not to scratch during Mass? Divine suffering indeed. Eventually, gloves gained popularity, not just for warmth, but for hygiene. If someone wore gloves year-round, it wasn't just fashion, it was self-preservation and shaking hands. Rare. Most greetings avoided contact altogether. A nod, a bow, or a muttered blessing were safer. Anything to avoid discovering your neighbour's hand hygiene habits the hard way. That's why customs like kissing rings or touching foreheads took hold. safer than palms still warm from post-poop protocol. What's wild is that this barbaric approach to wiping wasn't even questioned for centuries. It wasn't until modern plumbing and soft paper appeared that anyone thought, hey, maybe my behind deserves better. Now we've got aloe-infused triple-ply options, bidets, even heated toilet seats. But for most of history, wiping was about surviving, not thriving. A daily dance with splinters, stench, and socially acceptable filth. And yet, people got married, raised families, even wrote poetry, all with itchy butts. And just when you think it couldn't get worse, imagine this. You're out in the wild, it's the middle of winter, and all you've got is a handful of snow. Freezing, sharp, melting through your fingers. That was the last resort for many medieval travellers. Better than moss, debatable, but it definitely woke you up faster than any rooster ever could. Now, doesn't your toilet paper feel like a gift from the gods? You wake up in the middle of the night, stomach rumbling like an angry beast, and suddenly you feel it, nature's urgent call. But in the medieval world, there's no gentle glow of a bathroom light or soft slippers waiting by your bed. No. You reach for a chamber pot and find it already full. Congratulations, brave soul. That means you'll have to embark on one of the most dreaded missions of the Middle Ages. A bathroom trip through the cold, muddy, rat-infested darkness. You swing your feet over the side of the bed and immediately regret it. The floor isn't just cold, it's wet. Your toes sink into something that might be mud, or might be something else. You freeze, squinting into the pitch-black room. Somewhere in the shadows, a chicken clucks. A mouse scurries past your foot. If you're lucky, you remember where the door is. If not, you'll find it by stubbing your toe on the only rock in the house. Slipping into a thin tunic, you wrap yourself in whatever cloth you can find. There's no such thing as bathroom robes here, just yesterday's burlap. You creak open the wooden door and a gust of freezing wind slaps you in the face. Your nose runs instantly. The ground outside is uneven, soft in places, and very, very slippery. You whisper a silent prayer to any deity who might spare you from falling face first into the family's waste ditch. The darkness outside isn't just a lack of light, it's total blindness. Stars flicker above you like spectators to your misery. No lanterns, no torches, no candles. You squint, trying to find the path you walked 100 times in daylight. But now it's unfamiliar and hostile. Each step is a gamble. You hold your breath and inch forward, like a burglar in your own backyard, terrified of what lies ahead, or underfoot. Your ears become your only guide. You hear the slosh of mud, the rustle of leaves, and then something squeaking. A rat? Oh, probably. A fox? Possibly. You pause. Your bladder doesn't. It tightens in defiance. Every part of your body begs you to hurry, but running means slipping, and slipping means an intimate meeting with whatever your neighbours threw out the window that day. You take another cautious step. You feel watched, like the trees are judging your urgency. Finally, you reach the bush. Or maybe it's a pile of firewood. Who cares? You squat, hoping it's solid and not the edge of a ditch. You brace yourself on a stick. No. Wait, that's not a stick. You yelp and jump. It moves. A hedgehog darts off, equally terrified. Your heart races. This is not the peaceful moonlit experience poets write about. This is survival. The medieval version of a horror film, where the monster is mud and shame. You finish your business, trying not to breathe through your nose. There's no paper, of course. You reach for the moss patch you thought was safe, but it's damp. Not morning dew. Damp mystery damp. You flinch. At this point, dignity has long left the building. You wipe sort of. Good enough. You stand and feel a cold breeze where no breeze should be. That's the medieval stamp of authenticity. Everything ends with a chill. Now begins the return journey. You shuffle back, barefoot, your feet covered in mud and mystery. Your teeth chatter. A dog barks in the distance, and you pray it's not one of the neighbours' half-wild strays. Each step feels longer, like the house is shrinking away from you on purpose. The wind howls through the trees. It sounds like laughter. Maybe it is. You wouldn't be surprised if the forest spirits were mocking your nightly pilgrimage. You reach your front door and twist the latch. It sticks. Of course it does. Your fingers are numb and muddy. You shake the handle, trying not to wake the entire household, or worse, drop something precious while juggling your tunic and balance. The door finally creaks open. You step inside victorious, only to trip over your own child who rolled onto the floor during sleep. He groans. You fall. Your knees hit the floor with a squish. The chamber pot is still full. It mocks you from across the room. You ignore it, crawl into your bed, and pull the blanket over your face. Your feet are wet. Your backside's frozen. Your pride? Non-existent. And yet, somehow, you smile. You survived. You're home. You didn't fall in the ditch or get bitten by a raccoon. That, my friend, is what counts as a win in the medieval night. But, just as you start to drift off, someone else stirs. A groan. Then a whisper. Is the pot empty? You sigh. Your eyes open. And you realize your heroic journey wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The cycle continues. The legacy lives on town. And the night is far from over. You wouldn't envy the gong farmer. Not even on your worst day. Imagine this. It's midnight. You're knee-deep in fermented human waste, armed with nothing but a wooden shovel and a nose that gave up hours ago. That was your job. No gloves. No boots. Just layers of rags tied around your legs like a poor man's armor. Each step squelched like the earth itself was vomiting. You couldn't afford to gag. Your stomach had to be braver than your feet. You worked in silence because everyone slept. The world above rested while the underworld oozed. If you were lucky, you'd scoop out 10 cesspits by dawn. If unlucky, you'd fall into one. And yes, some did. Drowning wasn't just for sailors. Gong farmers, who slipped or passed out from fumes, were found days later, bloated and coated in misery. The stench never left them. Even in death, their bodies reeked like a curse no priest could cleanse. But here's the twisted part. They were paid well. In a world where farmers starved and blacksmiths broke their backs for pennies, a gong farmer made more in a week than many did in a month. It was danger pay without the glamour. They were essential like the immune system of the city. Without them, waste would flood streets, homes, even markets. But no one thanked them. No one looked them in the eye. You existed only to scrape what others preferred to forget. Their profession had rules. Gong farmers could only work at night and were forbidden from entering public spaces during the day. No taverns, no churches, no markets. If you tried, you'd be shoved away like disease in human form. Kids threw stones. Adults crossed the street. Your coin spent the same, but your presence spoiled the air. Even dogs barked at you like you'd offended the gods with your very breath. They say smell is the strongest sense tied to memory. For Gong farmers, memory was a punishment. Even fresh air, tasted like dung. Meals, seasoned by phantom fumes. Sleep, haunted by the squelch of filth against flesh. You didn't dream, you detoxed. And relationships. You think anyone wanted to marry someone who smelled like humanity's worst moments? Most lived alone, unkissed, unmourned. You might as well have married the cesspit. Still, some took pride in the job. Strange, right? But when you're invisible to the world, your pride comes from within. They knew their work kept plague away. They were the wall between life and rot. Their bodies decayed faster, their lungs collapsed sooner, but they slept knowing the streets were cleaner because of them. That kind of honor, it doesn't glitter, but it anchors a soul. Like a knight of the underworld, wielding a bucket instead of a blade. And oh, the tools. Wooden shovels warped from moisture, rusty iron scrapers, buckets that leaked from the seams. Everything you touched was contaminated, including your hands. The smarter ones soaked their fingers in vinegar before and after each job. It didn't help much. Some wore garlic around their necks, others chewed herbs to stop from retching. And still, they vomited into the same pit they cleaned. Circle of life, or something darker. Their bodies told the story better than words. Cracked skin, blackened nails, eyes bloodshot from ammonia vapors, teeth lost early, knees ruined, ankles swollen, their backs curved like question marks, as if even their posture asked, "Why me?" And yet they kept going, night after night, shovel after shovel, because someone had to. And society, in its quiet hypocrisy, chose them, not because they were less, but because they were willing. Sometimes they sang while they worked, not joyful songs, but low, grumbling hums that echoed in the stone chambers. You'd hear it if you ever passed an alley at 2 a.m, a ghostly chorus beneath your feet. It wasn't music, it was endurance, vocalized. A reminder that while you slept warm and dry, someone was battling rot. Just so your dawn would smell a bit less like death. Of course, every gone farmer had stories. Finding rings, bones, even a baby skull once. Some claimed to see spirits in the pits, ghosts of those who died without dignity. Others believed the waste held secrets, that each cesspit was a library of shame. They knew things about people, what they ate, how they lived, what they hid, but they told no one. Not out of respect, but because no one cared to ask. And as brutal as it sounds, you can't help but admire them, not for their courage or endurance, but for their ability to walk into hell and return night after night, knowing they'd never be thanked, never be praised. They lived forgotten and died unknown, but without them, entire cities would have choked on their own filth. Heroes, in a way, just ones you'd never want to hug. And now, as you prepare to follow their footsteps into the next layer of medieval bathroom misery, remember, the people who cleaned up the mess weren't the lowest. They were the last line of defense. You just didn't notice because they worked in the dark and smelled like the end of the world. Imagine this. You're doubled over in pain, your stomach churning like a cursed cauldron, and the village healer peers at you thoughtfully before grabbing a rusty knife and some leeches. Welcome to medieval medicine, where your upset stomach wasn't treated with peppermint tea or a heating pad. No, you were more likely to be bled like a goat or force-fed chalk mixed with beer. It wasn't about solving the problem. It was about surviving the treatment without making it worse. Diarrhea, though common, was treated like a demonic possession. One wrong meal and your bowels turned against you like a vengeful spirit. So they'd cut your skin open, slap on some leeches, and pray the demons would drain out with your blood. If that didn't work, they might try boiling herbs or powdered bone. The smell alone could kill a goat, and the taste? Let's just say you'd wish for death. Oddly enough, many patients miraculously recovered, possibly just to avoid another round. On the flip side, constipation was seen as a blockage of the soul. The remedies were as creative as they were horrifying. You might be prescribed a warm enema made from boiled dandelions, onion water, or, brace yourself, pig's urine, administered with a horn, no less. There was no anesthesia, no gentle nurse. Just you clenching onto a straw mattress while someone poured farm juice into your behind. Not exactly the luxurious spa cleanse modern influencers rave about. Hemorrhoids were treated with a level of brutality that would make even the toughest knight weep. If you dared to complain about the burning ring of fire, you were marched to a wooden table where red-hot iron awaited. No numbing, no comfort, just the iron searing away. Your dignity, and, if you screamed, that was considered part of the healing process. The church even encouraged silence during treatment, because excessive pain was seen as purification. Yeah, bless that. Let's talk about urine. It wasn't just waste, it was a diagnostic tool. Physicians would hold your pee up to the light, like a fine wine, and assess its clarity, color, even scent. Cloudy, you might have a demon. Pale, you're lazy. Blood-tinged, probably doomed. They had entire charts mapping ailments based on the shade of yellow alone. Some even tasted it. Yes, tasted it. If your doctor licked your pee, congratulations, you were receiving premium medieval health care. But don't think medieval folks didn't care about hygiene. Oh, they cared. They just didn't understand it. You had a rectal abscess, the healer might rub pigeon fat on it, or goat dung mixed with butter. If your stomach was upset, they'd recommend tying a dead mole around your waist. None of this was meant to hurt you. Quite the opposite. It was earnest, desperate wisdom handed down through generations. And it mostly made things worse. Now painkillers were a joke. There were no pills, no injections, no sweet relief. You got ale. Maybe a poppy seed, if you were lucky and noble. For everyone else, pain was just another part of life. Screaming was expected. Crying, encouraged. Passing out from the agony, a blessing. Some healers believed enduring pain made you more righteous. Others just didn't want to waste their good herbs on peasants. Either way, if you lived, it wasn't thanks to the cure. It was despite it. Infections were rampant. Wounds from latrine splinters or chamber pot accidents often festered into swollen, oozing nightmares. Doctors would slice them open, drain the pus, and stuff the cavity with mouldy bread or moss. This was called drawing out the evil. Sometimes it worked, probably by accident. Sometimes the infection spread to your bones and you lost a limb. If that happened, well, they'd saw it off. No sterilization. Just grit your teeth and try not to faint into your own blood. The plague, of course, terrified everyone, and many believed it entered through the rear. So, bizarrely, they'd cork their rectums with cloth or dried figs soaked in vinegar. Others wore plague thongs, made from herbs and tied with string to prevent evil mists from entering. Doctors wore beaked masks, sure, but peasants shoved garlic up their butts, all in the name of protection. You've never truly known fear until someone chases you with a fig and says, "It's for your own good." And while cities had rudimentary hospitals, they were mostly death houses. Monks with no medical training handed out random cures while chanting prayers. Some patients were treated with music therapy, others were exorcised, and a few were simply left in a corner with a bowl of porridge and a crucifix. The lucky ones were left alone. The unlucky ones were experimented on like alchemy projects. If you checked in, your odds of checking out upright were slim. Then there were travelling healers, quacks, with a cart and a cloak full of jars. They'd roll into town shouting about miracle tonics that cured everything from dysentery to heartbreak. Their potions were often wine mixed with random herbs, but the showmanship was dazzling. People bought into it because what else was there? Hope is a powerful drug. Even if that hope came in a bottle that smelled like horse sweat and burned your insides on the way down. So next time you have a stomachache and reach for antacids, be thankful, because once upon a time someone would have treated you with hot metal and mule fat. They meant well, truly. But medieval medicine was a gamble with more pain than promise. And if you're wondering how this nightmare evolved, well, it didn't end in the outhouse. The next chapter only gets darker, and a little more devilish. Back then, the devil didn't dwell in deep forests or haunted castles. He lived in your bathroom, or rather, the spot where you relieved yourself. The church preached that excessive cleanliness wasn't just suspicious, it was practically sinful. Touching yourself too often, even just to clean, was said to invite lustful thoughts or demonic temptation. Imagine being scolded not for poor hygiene, but for being too clean. You weren't just dirty, you were holy. Or at least that's what they told you. Bathing? That was a whole other spiritual crisis. People believed that warm water opened the pores, and with them, the gateway to hell. Demons, they thought, slipped into your body through those expanded pores, like burglars through an open window. The more you washed, the more vulnerable your soul became. So if someone stank to high heaven, it wasn't because they were lazy. It was because they were devout. Godliness apparently came with body odor. The church took this seriously. Bathhouses, once popular social hubs, were labelled dens of sin and temptation, because people, brace yourself, were naked in there. Scandalous. Bathing with others was equated with carnal desires, and soon the church shut many bathhouses down. Priests warned that sharing warm water could stir impure thoughts. Public nudity and cleanliness are one-way ticket to moral collapse. So naturally many stopped washing altogether. After all, a dirty body was better than a tainted soul. Even monks and nuns were discouraged from bathing more than a few times per year. Some proudly wore the same undergarments until they disintegrated. Others layered clothing to protect themselves from temptation, and in doing so created portable sweat chambers that could knock out a donkey. Their piety reeked, quite literally, but in the eyes of the church, that odour was incense. And that layer of grime? A spiritual shield against Satan's seductive whispers. Latrines were sacred battlegrounds. They weren't just gross, they were dangerous. People believed demons lurked beneath the seat, waiting for you to let your guard down. The moment your trousers dropped, you were exposed, physically and spiritually. That's why many muttered prayers before squatting, clutching rosaries with trembling fingers, while trying not to fall into the pit. Some even carried relics or hung crosses above the toilet. It wasn't about modesty. It was spiritual survival. If you suffered from hemorrhoids or constipation, it wasn't a medical issue, it was moral decay. The devil, they said, punished sinners through their bowels. A wicked gut was evidence of a wicked heart. No one looked at your diet. No one asked about stress. Instead, you were given penance. Pray more. Confess more. Fast for 3 days. And maybe, just maybe, the next time you sat down, you wouldn't scream in agony. The pain wasn't punishment, it was purification. Even dreams involving toilets were cause for concern. If you dreamed about defecation, you were told to confess immediately. Your subconscious, they claimed, was bubbling with lust, greed, or worse. One bishop even wrote about a woman who dreamt of bathing and was exorcised the next day. Cleanliness was seen as evidence of inner corruption. In a time where most people dreamed of food or firewood, dreaming of a bath made you a suspect. Children were taught early to avoid vanity, even in the chamber pot. Wiping too carefully? That meant you were obsessed with your body. Using scented herbs or cloths That was pride. Parents scolded their kids for wanting to feel clean. Humility meant embracing discomfort. If your backside burned or itched, you were supposed to accept it like a test of faith. And yes, some believed scratching was sinful. The devil worked in mysterious, itchy ways. Hygiene tools were burned or buried if they seemed too pleasurable. Smooth cloths or polished washing stones were banned in some regions. The church feared people might enjoy using them. Pleasure, even the accidental kind, was dangerous. Washing wasn't just physical, it was spiritual flirtation. And the devil? He loved a good sponge. So people used rough straw, cold water, and guilt. Lots of guilt. Not just to cleanse, but to suffer through the cleansing. It wasn't just Christian Europe. In many medieval societies, bodily functions were entwined with spirituality. Islamic scholars, for instance, emphasized cleanliness, but with strict rules and rituals. Hindus bathed daily, often in sacred rivers, but believed certain bodily impurities required specific rites. In contrast, Christian Europe embraced filth as virtue. Across cultures, toilets weren't just functional, they were moral landscapes, shaped by fear, faith, and folklore. But nowhere did the stink carry such sacred weight as in medieval Europe. There were whispers of demons who lived only in latrines. Some said they entered your soul when you let your guard down on the throne. Tales spread of cursed toilets that swallowed men whole or made them speak in tongues. Exorcists were called for chronic constipation. One man reportedly screamed biblical verses backward after using a public latrine. Was he sick? Possessed? No one knew. But the priest banned the toilet, and yes, it stayed blocked for years. So now, picture yourself tiptoeing into the dark with a flickering candle, clutching a wooden cross and whispering prayers as you approach the pit. Not for comfort, but for protection. Because in this world, the toilet wasn't just where you relieved your body. It was where you confronted your demons. Literally. But just wait until you hear what happened when the sewer itself decided to fight back. Imagine a sewer that didn't actually go anywhere. That was the medieval version of urban planning. What passed for a sewer in most towns was little more than a shallow trench dug through the centre of the street. It wasn't underground. It wasn't lined. It wasn't covered. It simply existed, open, public, and waiting, and everything to join the stream. Waste blood, kitchen scraps, dead rats, and the occasional misplaced sandal flowed through it like a toxic soup of civilization. These trenches were charmingly called kennels in England, and they had the smell to match. You'd walk out your front door and immediately get hit by a wave of stench that could curl your toes and send your breakfast running back up your throat. And that's on a good day. In summer, the heat would bake the waste into a sticky paste. In winter, it froze into jagged, icy blades of frozen filth. Either way, you went winning. The thing is, these sewers didn't actually sew anything together. No connection to a river. Exit strategy. Well, just a long, narrow corridor of rot that often ended abruptly or sloped back toward the houses. That's right. When it rained, the waste didn't flush away. It came back. Flooded cellars. Contaminated wells. Stew water that smelled suspiciously familiar. You'd see toddlers playing beside the trench, barefoot giggling, possibly already infected with the next great plague. Rats loved it. These open ditches were rat heaven. They bred in the muck, nested in the corners, and scurried beneath homes like furry sewer ghosts. And where rats go, lice follow. And where lice go, well, so does death. Bubonic, typhoid, dysentery, take your pick. You weren't just walking next to a sewer. You were walking next to a petri dish with teeth. And you could hear them at night, scratching, squealing, feasting. It was a lullaby of doom. You couldn't even pretend to escape it by going indoors. The smells seeped in. Homes were porous, like sponges. Wood absorbed odor. like it was collecting medieval misery for future release. Even wealthy homes with tapestries and fine floors couldn't block out the scent entirely. And lower-class homes, their walls practically invited the filth in. Mud floors, open windows, no ventilation. You'd fall asleep to the scent of rotting cabbage, spoiled meat, and something else you hoped was just soup. Town leaders tried to help. Sometimes, sort of. They'd post signs instructing citizens not to dump waste directly into the street, but enforcement was spotty. Occasionally, they'd assign someone to scrape the filth from the ditches and relocate it to a pile further out. But guess what? That pile became its own problem. Hills of human waste stewing just outside city walls. The breeze, ever generous, brought that sweet aroma right back home. It was a loop of stink. Vendors in marketplaces set up shop just feet from these channels of decay. Picture yourself browsing for apples while trying to ignore a pile of horse entrails floating nearby. Maybe that sausage you're buying was rinsed in water drawn from a well, contaminated by that very same trench. Or maybe you're lucky, and the vendor just has a stronger nose than you. Either way, you are gambling with your health, your taste buds, and your soul. The worst part, no one seemed alarmed. It was normal, expected. Children were born into it. Old folks died surrounded by it. You adapted or you suffered. Some even claimed the stink toughened them, built character, made their lungs stronger. But more often, it made them dead. Coughs turned into fevers, fevers turned into funerals, and everyone kept dumping waste in the same ditch. Because when the entire town stinks, it stops being a problem. It becomes culture. Some towns tried to install covered drainage tunnels, stone arches that redirected waste underground. But only the rich areas got them. The poor still got their kennels open and humming like compost pits on fire, and even the covered tunnels eventually backed up. Blockages formed. Rats found cozy little hidouts, and the water? Stagnant. Bacteria thrived in those forgotten veins of the city. But hey, at least you couldn't see the filth anymore. Out of sight, out of smell. Kind of. There were moments when it rained hard enough to sweep the streets clean, or at least dilute the horror. People celebrated those days. Children splashed in puddles that carried human waste, never realizing they were dancing in disaster. Merchants thanked the heavens for freshness in the air. But the relief was temporary. As the sun returned, the moisture baked into the stones, and the odor rose once more. Nature gave, then nature steamed it back up again. The irony. Many towns charged taxes for waste management. Citizens paid for the privilege of watching their own sewage swirl by their doorstep. Some cities even had dedicated waste inspectors, whose job was to sniff around and issue fines. But corruption thrived. Inspectors looked the other way for bribes. The trench grew wider, the waste grew deeper, and the townsfolk kept stepping over it, sometimes into it, pretending things were just fine. A medieval illusion of sanitation. So the next time you flush a toilet, hear that elegant swirl and smell nothing at all, take a breath, a deep one. Because in the Middle Ages, that breath might have carried the scent of 5 families, leftovers, 2 horse corpses, and a dead cat floating past your window. And as we step deeper into the world of waste, prepare yourself, because the poop economy is about to get personal. You'd think a medieval marketplace was just for vegetables, fish, and the occasional rat on a stick. But no, beneath the clamour of shouting merchants and clinking coins was a pungent economy, thriving in plain sight. Human waste, animal droppings, and heaps of compost weren't just nuisances, they were commodities. Farmers saw value in what others gagged at. In a world without synthetic fertilizers, excrement was liquid gold. So next time you wrinkle your nose at a cow pasture, just know, you would have been buying that bucket back then. Walking through the muddy lanes, you'd be forgiven for thinking you stepped into a dung exhibit. The streets weren't just dirty. They were layered. Day and your fish guts and yesterday's piss mingled underfoot. But this wasn't carelessness. It was industry. That black sludge beneath your boots? Someone was already eyeing it for their cabbage patch. Merchants didn't just sell carrots, they sold crap to grow them. And behind every delicious medieval stew was a spoonful of something you'd rather not think about. Kids played near it. Dogs rolled in it. Chickens pecked through it for worms. And guess what? It all got swept up and sold. Markets had stalls for everything: meat, fabrics, relics, and poop. Some vendors carried it in buckets, others wheeled in cartloads. Gong farmers brought the human stuff, stable hands provided the horse pies. If it stank, it sold. Buyers sniffed for quality, like sommeliers. Ah, this one's ripe, must be from the castle stables. And yes, people haggled over price. Literal shut negotiations. Of course, not everyone was thrilled. There were complaints, especially from nobles who didn't like the smell wafting into their perfumed halls. But the truth was, their own waste often ended up in these markets too. Castle cesspits had to be emptied, and guess where the waste went? Not to some medieval landfill, straight into barrels marked for sale. What nobles flushed, peasants purchased. It's poetic, in a way. Full circle economy at its most aromatic. And irony, like manure, was always in abundance. Demand was constant. Every season, every harvest, crops needed fuel. And poop, oddly enough, didn't discriminate. Rich soil came from the poor man's chamber pot, and the wealthy lady's privy alike. But this also meant danger. Disease didn't care about intention. If dung wasn't aged properly, it could spread sickness. Typhoid, cholera, dysentery, all fermented in this ecosystem. Yet still, the trade went on. Because in medieval minds, a little risk of death was worth a better cabbage. Even city councils joined in. Some towns taxed dung sales. Others regulated dumping hours. A few even issued licenses for collectors. You couldn't just toss waste in a ditch. You needed a permit to profit from it. It came a job title: dung merchant, waste vendor, compost broker. Children inherited the family trade. One day, son, this pile will be yours. Imagine growing up hearing that and feeling pride instead of horror. But that was the medieval way. Survival over sentiment. Interestingly, people used scent to judge social class. If you smelled like roses, you were suspicious. Too clean meant vanity, or worse, witchcraft. But if you carried the earthy perfume of the street, you belonged. Peasants, traders, even priests, everyone stank in their own way. The stink became the sound of commerce, a marker of status. Women used herbs under their noses. Men just embraced the aroma. After all, the more you smelled, the more people assumed you worked hard, or lived long enough to reek. Washing wasn't always an option. Water sources were often downstream. Yes, after all, the waste was dumped. So rinsing off meant adding more disease to your skin. Better to stay crusty than risk infection. That's why clothes were rarely washed, and when they were beaten on rocks near the same polluted streams. It was an endless loop. Soil, grow, eat poop, sell, soil again. Hygiene wasn't even on the menu. But survival was, and that made all the difference. And yes, rivalries existed. Competing dung dealers fought over prime scooping spots. Near butchers, stables or latrines, wherever the freshest piles emerged. Some bribed gong farmers for early access. Others stole from rivals' carts. Fights broke out. One wrong shove, and someone ended up face first in a transaction gone wrong. Medieval business was cutthroat and filthy. Very filthy. But profitable. Sometimes the dirtiest jobs pay the cleanest coin. When gold smells like shat, nobody complains, at least not out loud. Even literature and folklore reference the poop economy. Stories of poor boys who struck it rich by discovering a magical compost heap. Tales of cursed dung that grew haunted pumpkins. Songs sung about the brave men who fell into cesspits and came back legends. It was humour, horror, and heritage rolled into one. Medieval bards didn't shy away from stink. They sang through it, about it, for it, because when life gives you feces, make a fable. The church, of course, had opinions. Waste was a metaphor. Dung represented sin, filth of the soul. Some monks refused to touch it, while others saw cleaning it as a path to humility. Pilgrims walked barefoot through filthy markets as acts of penance. The stink humbles the flesh, they said. And maybe it did. Or maybe it just clogged your nose until you stopped noticing. Either way, people kept trudging through, knowing tomorrow would smell exactly the same. So the next time you flush a toilet, or wrinkle your nose at a garbage bin, remember there was once a world where the stink was currency. The floor was a toilet, and the poop had a price. In the medieval marketplace, nothing was wasted, not even waste. And as you drift off to sleep, let that image settle in your brain. A peasant in love with a bucket, wheeling his fortune toward the fields. That, dear friend, was entrepreneurship in its rawest form. In medieval times, there wasn't just a right and wrong. There was a right and left. And believe me, you didn't want to confuse the two. The left hand had a special job. It was the wiping hand. Sacred, dirty, and avoided like the plague, literally. People didn't need signs or warnings. Etiquette was unwritten, but deeply understood. You ate with your right. You greeted with your right. The left? It stayed in your lap, hidden like a shameful secret that everyone shared. Now imagine growing up knowing that touching food with your left hand would earn you a slap or a side eye. Not because it was rude, but because it was gross, disgusting, offensive. It meant one thing: you wiped with it. There wasn't a bin of fresh toilet paper waiting in the privy. Just your hand. Maybe some water. Maybe a handful of straw. Most of the time, it was just you, your left palm, and prayers you didn't miss a spot. Why the left? Well, most people are right-handed. So it made sense. The right hand needed to stay clean for eating, working, praying. The left was already considered lesser, cursed in some traditions, even evil. So it got the dirty job, quite literally. And over time, that habit embedded itself into social behavior so deeply that shaking with your left hand was worse than swearing. You might as well spit in someone's soup, because that's the hand that had been places. You didn't see many gloves back then, but when you did, guess which hand got covered first? The left. Not for warmth or fashion. No, gloves were a buffer, a way to say, hey, I know where this hand's been. Let's not spread the love. Some wealthier folks even wore one glove just for wiping. Others tied rags around their left wrists. It was part hygiene, part etiquette, and part psychological armor. After all, pretending to be clean was half the battle. But here's the real kicker. This rule wasn't just a Western thing. Cultures across the world, from India to the Middle East, adopted the same logic. The wiping hand rule became a universal code, a silent agreement among humans that some things are just too gross to ignore. Even now, in some countries, it still holds weight. Ask for food with your left hand in certain places, and you'll get nothing but judgment, and maybe a fork thrown in your direction. In the medieval world, though, It wasn't just about hands, it was about survival. With so much filth everywhere, you needed boundaries. If everyone used both hands for everything, diseases would spread even faster than they already did. And they spread fast. Plague, cholera, dysentery. It was a party of pathogens. The wiping hand rule was an attempt, however small, to contain the madness. A primitive form of public health, born out of necessity and reinforced by disgust. Now think about how this shaped interactions. A handshake wasn't just a greeting, it was a trust fall. You had to believe the other person followed the rule. And if they didn't, well, some disputes began and ended over which hand was extended. People even developed little tests. Watch how they eat. Watch how they scratch their face. If the left hand goes near the bread, you slide your plate away. Subtle, but serious. Your stomach depended on it. Social gatherings had an unspoken choreography. People stood to the right of each other, passed items clockwise, and gestured with care. If someone handed you a gift with their left hand, it was seen as an insult. Not just a mild one, a genuine slap in the face. The kind of offense that lingered. Did you see what he did? Left hand, left hand. Suddenly, alliances broke. Friendships ended. All because of a moment's thoughtless reach for the wine jug. But not everyone followed the rule. There were rebels, people who didn't care, or worse, people who didn't know. Outsiders, foreigners, or the plain unhygienic. These were the true threats, the ones whispered about in alleyways. He eats with both hands, someone would mutter, and the crowd would recoil. Some even used the rule as a weapon, pretending to be clean, then switching hands mid-meal, just to offend. Yes, even in a world of nights and plagues, pettiness found a way. The rule also bled into religion and ritual. In some monasteries, monks would train themselves to eat only with the right wipe, only with the left, and never confuse the two, not even under torture. It became a spiritual discipline, a way to purify the soul through the hands. Some priests gave sermons about it. The right hand feeds the body, the left cleanses the sin. Poetic, maybe. Disturbing, definitely. But hey, medieval theology had its quirks and smells. And then there's the irony. People followed the wiping hand rule religiously, but still didn't wash their hands. Not really. Soap was rare, and even when available, it wasn't always used. So while etiquette dictated which hand touched food, nobody stopped to think. Maybe just wash both. Maybe clean the hands before touching literally anything? Not. Too complicated. Mouse, wine, yell, lie. Too luxurious. When you could just assign roles and pretend the bacteria followed the rules too. Today, the legacy lingers. We don't talk about it, but we've all been shaped by it. The preference for the right hand. The suspicion of the left. The instinct to avoid someone scratching with their left fingers. It's all part of a cultural memory that still whispers in our etiquette. And as strange as it sounds, it's kind of beautiful. Because even in a world of mud and misery, humans found a way to stay just clean enough to survive. And shake on it. No one spoke of the smell. It just existed. Like the sky or the seasons. You didn't question it because it was everywhere. In your clothes, your food, your dreams. You'd wake up to it before your eyes even opened. The warm fog of human animal and rot pressing into your skin. Breathing was no longer a choice. It was an endurance. Over time, your body gave up fighting. You didn't adapt. You simply gave in. This was life. Odor first, dignity second. You didn't smell bad. You were bad smelling. Your entire being was soaked in layers of fish brine chamber, hot splash, and mouldy straw. And oddly, no one noticed. Until you smelled too good. If you washed too often, wore too much lavender, or didn't have a whiff of manure about you, people stared, whispered. Maybe you were vain. Maybe immoral. Clean skin was suspicious. The stink was safety. A shield. A silent declaration. I belong. Imagine falling in love like that. You meet someone at the market. Their hair is matted. Their tunic holds the scent of cabbage, fire smoke, and something unspoken. You exchange a glance. No words. Just shared suffering and a mutually tolerated stench. Courtship wasn't about flowers and poetry. It was about accepting someone's stink as your own. True romance meant sharing a bed and not gagging. If that isn't love, what is? Homes weren't exempt. You didn't escape the smell at night. It got worse. The walls were made of wattle and daub, which absorbed every drop of sweat and waste. Fires added smoke, and chamber pots added spice. Some rooms smelled so bad they had names. The pig corner, the rot wall, that spot by Uncle Gregor. You'd walk in and immediately know who'd been there and what they'd done. No need for questions. Bathing? Rare, suspicious, and reserved for the rich or the sick. Bath might be boiled herbs in a wooden tub, reused by the whole family, of course. The water turned from brown to black with each body. You'd step in last and it was like soup. Skin soup. Musk. If you were lucky, it was warm. If you were unlucky, it was textured. You emerged dirtier than when you entered, but at least you tried. The idea of fresh was foreign. Fresh food, fresh clothes, fresh air. Dreams. Bread was hard, clothes were damp, and air was thick with the stew of the town. No deodorant. No detergent. Just clay vinegar or desperate hope. People chewed herbs to hide their breath, rubbed themselves with ash to mask body odour, or, if really desperate, stuck dried flowers in their armpits. Yes, armpit potpourri. It didn't work, but it gave them dignity. You couldn't escape it, even outside. Streets were rivers of waste. Barnyard puddles, spilled beer, blood urine, all mixed by wagon wheels into a symphony of scent. On hot days the smell ripened. On rainy days it splashed. Walking became a game of chance. Step wrong, and you'd carry the stench home in your boots and your soul. The marketplace reeked of onions, sweat, and raw meat. And still, people laughed there. Churches were no different. The holiest of places still held unholy smells. Packed pews, bodies squeezed shoulder to shoulder, prayers rising with the heat of human breath. Some fainted, others wept, but no one mentioned the obvious. Maybe it was a test of faith. Maybe God smelled it too. The incense helped a little, but not enough. And if someone farted mid-sermon, you'd see saints lose their composure. Blessings and gags side by side. Children went spared. They grew up with the stink as their lullaby. Babies were swaddled in reused cloth, wiped with straw, and nursed next to manure piles. Kids played in the dirt, which wasn't just dirt, and shared beds where everyone sweated, sneezed, and snored together. By the time they could speak, they knew how to ignore the smell. Some even loved it, called it nostalgia. After all, has a powerful nose. And yet, through the stink, life happened. Meals were shared. Songs were sung. People married, danced, told stories under the stars. The smell didn't break them. It shaped them. It humbled them. You learn to look past the surface, quite literally, and see the person beneath. When everyone stinks, kindness speaks louder. Community matters more, and laughter somehow smells clean. Of course, modern noses wouldn't survive a minute. One whiff, and you'd cry, retch, or run. but theirs. Hardened by life, softened by ritual. They burned herbs, prayed, kissed, embraced, through it all. Their bodies were fragile, but their spirits. If they could fall in love, raise children, and find joy in that chaos, then maybe, just maybe, we're the soft ones now. Because back then surviving meant silencing your nose, thriving meant silencing your fear. And love, it bloomed not in perfume, but in the rank reality of shared struggle. And in that stink, they found something sacred, something we, with all our soaps and sprays, might have forgotten. But don't worry, what comes next might just jog your memory. And maybe now, the next time you flush a toilet or wash your hands with lavender soap, you'll feel a bit luckier. Because let's be honest, we're living in an age of comfort that medieval folks couldn't even imagine. No overflowing chamber pots, no sponges on a stick, no rats crawling up through guardrabes, just porcelain, plumbing, and peace of mind. But what does that say about us? Are we really more civilized? Or just more sanitized? Have we truly evolved, or simply replaced the discomfort of foul smells with the noise of endless distractions? We don't talk about these things, not really. But maybe we should. Maybe it's in the filth, in the forgotten corners of history, that we see ourselves most clearly. So here's a question. If people could fall in love, write poetry, start revolutions, and raise families in a world that smelled like sewage, what's your excuse for not chasing your dream? The past isn't there to disgust us. It's there to humble us, to make us laugh, cringe, and, above all, reflect. So if this little trip through time gave you a fresh perspective, leave a comment below and share your thoughts. I'd love to hear what surprised you most. And if you know someone who complains about modern bathrooms, send them this video. Don't forget to subscribe and tap the notification bell so you never miss another strange, uncomfortable, yet oddly comforting tale from history. And now, breathe deep, close your eyes, and be grateful you're not sleeping next to a chamber pot tonight.